Welcome to The World We Got This with Esau Williams.
Hello and welcome. And today we'll be talking about the politics of the Grand Inga Dam, perhaps something you've never heard of before. But it's earmarked in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we'll be discussing why the decade's delay in bringing it about, also the impact on local communities, and what building what would be the world's largest hydroelectric plant would mean for the environment. Barnaby is lecturer in development policy and practice. He has studied the resurgence of dam building in Africa and is on the podcast. And alongside him, Mark Mulligan, professor of physical and environmental geography and co-developer of the Global Dam Watch database, an online tool that integrates global data on dams. And Clement Sefa-Nyarko lectures in security, development and leadership in Africa, and his work encompasses both natural resource governance and the green energy transition in Africa. So there are plans to build this magnificent multi-billion-dollar mega dam on the Congo River, one that would produce enough renewable electricity to power vast areas of Africa. The structure would be called the Grand Inga Dam. It would be twice, in terms of power generation, the capacity of China's 3 Gorges, and therefore the world's largest hydroelectric plant. The Grand Inga Dam enticed investors and developers, but decades after it was first dreamt up, the site reserved for the structure remains untouched. While DRC's government has insisted the plan is still in motion, critics argue that the long delays have caused it to be obsolete and that DRC's record of poor governance and the potential for serious environmental harm render it pointless. Well, let me start with you, Barnaby, first. Is there a resurgence just in general in terms of dam building in Africa? And if so, why?
Yes, in the last 2 decades, there has been a resurgence. We saw from the sort of mid-1990s the withdrawal of some of the major dam funders, most totemically the World Bank from backing a lot of large hydropower. But from the mid-2000s, partly a return of the World Bank gradually over time, but perhaps more importantly, the arrival of countries like China, who were then prepared to step in and fund dams in other countries, alongside others like Brazil and India, has led to a resurgence over the last 2 decades.
And is this also a sign of an embracing by those countries you've mentioned of new green energy, that they're actually fully on board with making that transition?
Well, it's a slightly complicated question because it depends on whether you view large dams as green. For a lot of the last 2 decades, these projects haven't been seen as renewable technically because although they are using a renewable energy resource in a sort of strictly physical sense, their negative social and environmental costs have meant that they haven't been classed as renewable, and so only sort of micro hydro power projects, so much smaller dams, have met that criteria. But in the last few years, a number of countries, including ones like Ghana, have reclassified renewable energy to include these large hydropower projects. And I think today there's sort of more acceptance of large dams as being renewable, but this is still something that's contested.
And Mark Mulligan, I introduced you as a co-developer of the Global Dam Watch database. Tell us what it is and what it's been telling you.
So Global Dam Watch is a collaboration between a number of organizations, universities across the world, conservation organizations and data providers. And it tries to bring together the world's information on dams, both very large dams, but also medium and smaller dams, to produce an open source, open access, comprehensive database of where dams are, what their characteristics are, how old they are, and all sorts of other information that can be used then either globally or nationally or within water basins, so watersheds, to look at the collective impacts of dams rather than looking at a single dam in isolation. Putting all the dams on a river network together and understanding their collective impact, both positively, because dams have plenty of positive impacts, in terms of economy and sustainability and so on, but also their negative impacts on environment, social and economic conditions.
And it sounds as though the verdict on dams then...
Yes, the verdict is mixed. I mean, you will always have to compare an energy generation mechanism or a water source mechanism with what the counterfactual is, what the alternative is. Everything, if we need energy, we need water. Dams underpin a huge amount of our global food production. They underpin a huge amount of our global energy use. They protect us from floods. You always have to compare, really, doing this by dams with doing it in other ways, because every mechanism to grow, you provide water for food, and every mechanism to provide energy has environmental and social impacts.
And were you able to take I know you do this generally, but were you able to take a specific look at the Grand Inga Dam and its impact potentially?
Well, we haven't done detailed analysis on it, but there is plenty of information out there because, as Barnaby said, the idea has been around for quite a long time. And if we were to pick 3 benefits and 3 risks associated with this dam, one of the benefits is it's a massive, relatively clean energy generation, huge capacity exceeding the UK's peak demand, in a single dam, and could power a huge chunk of Africa. Although we do have to consider that, producing energy in one place and getting it to other places where the demand for energy are quite different things. So that's one benefit. It's huge clean energy generation. It could lead to economic growth and job creation, at least during the construction phase, creating thousands of jobs, and supporting through the energy produced, industrialization in the wider area. And then the third benefit is certainly compared with some of the alternatives, fossil fuels in particular, there are reduced carbon emissions, and that can save, hundreds of millions of tons potentially of carbon emissions. Although, dams do tend to emit methane, but those tend to be the sort of large dams with very large reservoirs, which this wouldn't have as a run-of-river type scheme with a relatively small reservoir. Risks, well, I'm sure we'll pick up on this in the discussion, but it's going to cost a lot of money, as we heard, potentially $80 billion. So that's a huge debt risk. It's clearly, as all dams do that generate a reservoir, is going to displace people and homes and, graveyards and, archaeological sites, all these sorts of things. And it will have a threat more broadly to the environment of the area, both the dam itself and the reservoir that will, disrupt the river potentially, affecting maybe hundreds of fish species in the area and other biodiversity that goes underwater. But also more broadly, because, once you put a very big dam project in, you've got to move the energy from that dam to where it's used. And that requires a network that itself will have impacts, both in the places that mine the steel and copper to produce that network, but also, of course, in the places that network goes through.
Okay, and let me just say to listeners at this point that the screams they are hearing is your bird, which is in a cage. So just so people know. But let me come to you, Clement Sefa-Nyarko. Now, in terms of security and development, it's pretty hard to argue against a dam, which, gives you relatively clean energy and clean water and also provides jobs.
Yeah, I mean, on paper, it looks fantastic. And it looks very clean. Obviously, Barnaby has argued, and rightly so, that, hydropower has only been recently recalibrated into the clean technology stuff. So in terms of cleanliness, there's an argument around that for and against. But that's also, can leave that for another day. Mark has mentioned methane that's also emitted from potentially large reservoirs. So the question is, if it's that good and it's going to serve benefits, why should we even consider security concerns if they are? Mm-hmm. I think fundamentally, the question we need to ask is, who are we building this dam for? Who are the beneficiaries? Obviously, those who would import most of that energy from the DRC will be South Africa, according to the data we've received. But also,
at least half of it.
Exactly. but also investors are going to cash in big time because people put in their money and it's more like a very transactional engagement. So are there any social benefits, and if there are, for who? Obviously not for the people who are going to host the dam. About 80% of the population in DRC do not have access to electricity in any case. And I don't think that it doesn't look like, and I don't think there is, based on the data available, that there's any intention to make this benefit the people who are going to suffer the most from the downsides of dam construction. And of course, there are so many downsides, apart from people who will be displaced, which we can discuss in terms of some of the dimensions of that displacement, and the fact that there will be no adequate compensation for people who will be moved from their homes and who lose access to cultural heritage and other things. They just won't benefit from this, despite all the inconveniences. So yes, I mean, there are, of course, and once there's something in a community that doesn't have access to its benefit, there are security concerns, there's potential for protest and anger that would, destabilize the region. So it's, I think this is really worth interrogating further.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know Barnaby wants to chime in quickly, but just before you do, Barnaby, let me ask you a question. You can do that first or last. But as far as the national decisions on a dam like the Grand Inga Dam, how does that come about? Because the last time I checked, DRC is in crisis. It's in a civil war.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a project, sort of as we've alluded to, that's been around for a long time and often been seen by outside actors or those in Kinshasa, the capital of DRC, as a sort of savior. And I think the reason why it's sort of been perpetually talked up. I mean, I remember going to an event in London about a decade ago where Gordon Brown was sort of singing the praises of this dam as the thing that could change African development. But the reason why it's sort of not happened, I think of a sort of challenges to achieving the benefits that Mark talked about. These are sort of brought out regularly, but really, sort of as Clement is saying, sort of require a lot of interrogation and I think critique. The idea that this is going to lead to some sort of status quo change in the political economy of DRC just seems extremely naive. These sorts of very large centralized projects are notorious around the world for having huge corruption risks. I think in the DRC context, we should be very suspicious about this, actually, sort of the money that goes into a project like this, even getting to building the dam, let alone sort of having wider impacts on the country. The idea that this could spur industrialization also seems sort of naive, given the position of the DRC in the global economy, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of skills, the lack of sort of political institutions you need to achieve that wider industrialization agenda. And then, the idea that this could even serve wider African electricity also seems really difficult. Doing regional energy trading on the continent has been extremely hard because governments don't trust each other, rightly so. DRC has been the subject of continental wars where Angola, Zimbabwe, Rwanda currently as well, at least allegedly, and Uganda have all intervened and have sent troops in and tried to sort of take control and influence who's in control in Kinshasa. So the idea that you could have a transmission line that goes to South Africa through Angola, Namibia, a constellation of countries in Central Africa, where the governments don't trust each other, where there are very personalized relationships between the presidential leaders, this sort of doesn't seem to work. And there's a reason, I guess, because of that, there just hasn't been the ability to attract investors to this project. And the project has always been styled as one where rather than the state coming in and financing the project, this is going to be one where private sector companies come in and provide the money, bankrolled by, if you like, guarantees that the international community led by the World Bank and the African Development Bank would provide. So they would sort of provide a sort of insurance risk. But ultimately, the money has to come from a private sector consortium. And very rightly, a lot of consortium after consortium of different private companies have concluded this project isn't going to work.
They're all pulling out.
We can't sell the electricity. Yeah. And therefore it sort of collapses again. And I think we're just seeing another cycle of that, where at the moment, some of the recent news reports on the dam seem to be driven by some sort of senior officials in the World Bank, as I understand the situation, who have decided this is going to be their big project and they want to try and finally get it over the line. But I don't think any of the fundamentals have really changed.
If I could just bring in Mark Mulligan on this one. I mean, you compile the data in terms of the studies and the impacts it has on people. Now, when you build a dam, what actually happens? I mean, is it a massive piece of land right across a river that you just sort of cut through and people are displaced? I mean, is it that serious? What's the scale of building a dam, for example?
Well, there are different types of dams, and let's say the two main types are dams that have a big reservoir that is impounded by the dam. And then there are run-of-river dams, right, where you don't build such a big reservoir. You take water from the river through a series of pipes, and then you route it through the landscape in those pipes and to a set of turbines, and you generate electricity in that way. They have quite different impacts, and they are suitable for different types of rivers. There are already plenty of reservoir dams in the Congo basin. If you look at the distribution of dams in the world, North America, Brazil, South Africa, India, Europe, parts of Australia, China, huge numbers of dams. Most of them are, impounding reservoirs because, again, they're there to retain the water for either irrigation or for dual functions, irrigation and hydropower. And for sure, when you impound a big body of water, that you do a number of things. The first thing you do is you turn a free-flowing river into a series of ponds, essentially, sort of linear ponds that flow much less. That changes their hydrology, it changes their geomorphology, the sort of movement of sediment through them. It changes their ecology because many species need to migrate or require particular flow conditions. And of course, it changes water availability for everyone downstream of a dam. Because you are literally building a huge wall, across your topography, and you are impounding water and covering a very, very large area with water. That, in a sense, creates some habitat and creates some opportunities, new fishing opportunities, for example, and of course the things that you're building the dam for, irrigation and hydropower largely. But these huge changes in landscapes, and most landscapes, of course, are populated, have all sorts of environmental impacts and other impacts too. Run-of-river dams can be better in terms of not disrupting the flow of rivers so much and not creating such a large reservoir. But, they're still extremely expensive projects. They're still extremely large engineering projects. They still do disrupt the river, and they still do have some impacts. And in the case of this area, there's a mix, of course, of impoundments and run-of-river type dams.
And you did write, Professor Mulligan, that the full impact, the downside impact of this hasn't been fully digested yet.
Well, I think that's true for most dams. I think when we look at the impacts of a dam, both social, economic and environmental, we tend to look at them in isolation. We don't tend to look at networks of dam in a river or indeed globally. And that's because often, most of the research on a dam is done during the sort of thinking phase and the development phase and the financing phase, rather than after the dam is actually built, or rather than, by organizations beyond those involved in the dam who are interested in the wider sort of regional impacts of multiple dams. So I think, as a result, we don't really understand how they work together. There are a number of global studies on sort of river connectivity, on the impacts of dams on earthquakes, on the impacts of dams on negative and positive impacts of dams on climate. And all the other things that they affect, but they're relatively new, relatively recent. And what we don't get usually when we add a new dam is, okay, this is how it'll work with the rest of the network.
Barnaby?
Yeah, just quickly, just to highlight a point that Mark was making there, especially I think about the lack of knowledge of downstream consequences from dams, which are often the ones that are sort of least studied and least understood. And in the Congo River could be, and given the sort of scale of this particular infrastructure project, could be really major, given this huge river, one of the world's biggest rivers, which has an enormous downstream effect, has a big delta. It has a large impact on the maritime environment in the Gulf of Guinea, which affects whole patterns of fish migration and an offshore ecology. And as far as I've seen in terms of the research on the negative impacts of this project, there's very little written about what the downstream impacts could be on that delta and on the fish environment, maritime environment, which, so this is often something that's really overlooked when considering whether this is a good idea or not.
Absolutely. And Clement, just from a security and development standpoint, give us sort of the ups and downs of both. Obviously we talked about the advantage of, job creation, of energy, but also what are the downsides and other plus sides we've not considered?
Yeah, I think most of the ups of that and the downs as well, Mark has outlined them in terms of course, it's going to provide electricity, but I've asked the question for who is going to give economic opportunities and job creation for young people, but also generally across the region. That cannot be overstated. The electricity will support industrialization for sure. And if you argue, and if you support the argument that hydropower is clean technology, then it is clean technology. So it's definitely going to replace fossil and other sources of energy in the region, which we cannot overemphasize its significance.
Could it help end the conflict? Are there opportunities there?
Yeah, those come down to the risks and the downsides. In terms of course, it's going to be require a lot of money for sure. People will be displaced, and we've said that in terms of displacement, probably it's time to look at it. Even in the types of displacement that's possible in terms of the people who would be moved. And obviously, the Inga has a combination of, reservoir construction of reservoirs and, the free flowing currents. And so people will be displaced in any case. And those displacements, often there will be compensations, but not enough. Or compensations are only promised and the people are moved and then they don't get what's required. And those could be in terms of physical displacement. So people were literally moved from their locations and compensated adequately or not. Mm-hmm. There will be economic displacement as well. So people, even if they are not physically moved, their livelihoods will be impacted. So people's farms may no longer be available to them. People will be restricted to other economic activities. People can't fish anymore, or they may have to move to other places to be able to access economic opportunities, right, which are all the social dimensions of that. But there's also a third level of displacement that's often even not considered mostly at all, and that's the socio-cultural displacement. That is where, I think Mark made allusions to that as well, where people are restricted access to, pilgrimage areas, burial grounds, access to sacred trees, sacred grounds and all those things. But those will be more the social. But of course, there will be the security dimensions, as you mentioned. There are all kinds of geopolitical, political dimensions happening there, where DRC already is a hotbed for conflict because Rwanda has interest, South Africa has interest, the West has interest, and all those are part of that whole contestations around who controls the space and who invests the most.
Right. And also just quickly, Clement, you were talking about the downside, but I also want to know about the upside. Could the dam, if they've started work on it, I don't know, this week or next, could it begin to end the conflict in DRC? Could it be a way of ending the conflict?
Potentially not. This dam was started by Seseseku Mobutu, and has remained on the agenda. Earlier phases of it have been completed. It's already supplying electricity. So it's not like it's just some dead pit sitting there. There were earlier versions that were constructed and completed, and it doesn't look like it's going to change much because it's still going to create a space where rent is going to be paid and rent is going to be received, and it's going to create even more regular space for countries that are already in conflict in DRC. Mind you, DRC is one of the countries that has the most deposits of cobalt, for instance, in Africa, arguably in the world. And DRC has almost every single critical mineral you can think about, most of them in Africa. And yet those are the very resources that are creating more tension and more conflict in DRC. Potentially this is going to heighten that tension.
Clement Sefa-Nyarko, thank you very much for now. Let me just pause for a moment to remind listeners about this podcast.
Du hører på? ನೀವು ಕೇಳುತ್ತಿರುವುದು You are listening to The World We Got This podcast.
And welcome back. This is Esau Williams with World We Got This podcast. And with me on the pod today is Barnaby, lecturer in development policy and practice, Mark Mulligan, Professor of Physical and Environmental Geography and Clement Sefa-Nyarko, lecturer in security and development and leadership in Africa, all from the great old King's College here in London, or King's College London to give it its proper title. And we're talking about, in case you had just joined us and wondering, the Grand Inga Dam, which is planning to be, if it's ever built, the magnificent multi-billion-dollar mega dam on the Congo River. And we're looking at the politics of it and also the environmental impact. So let me come to you, Professor Mark Mulligan. If you were, from a scientific point of view, advising the government in Kinshasa, should they go ahead and build this dam?
Well, I think that really depends on, what the alternative is for the production of energy, for the further development of the economy, and so on. I think it's generally accepted that smaller projects are usually better than fewer larger projects, and that's partly about the distribution of energy and the need to do that from single big projects over wide areas like this, causing enormous amounts of extra cost and political challenge and also environmental damage. But it's also because, if you put 80 billion into a single asset, and that is your sole source of energy for a very large area, that's an extremely risky thing to do. It's putting all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak. And it is better to diversify across a range of different types of energy generation to start with, so that you have your eggs across lots of different baskets, but also to spread your energy generation and therefore the benefits of it as well as the impacts over much, wider areas, and have your generation closer to your consumption. So, that would be my advice in a sense, but, again, we need a plan for that, and we need to look at the impacts of that as well. I think that the real challenge with all of these, big decisions that we have to make now about how we transition from fossil fuels and how we, increase the availability of electricity, in countries where that availability is low, is that we really need to do the research. We need to look at the alternatives. We need to thoroughly investigate them environmentally, socially, economically. And the policy needs to be led by evidence. And so, in a sense, what I would say, in a couple of words is, well, yeah, let's look into it and let's find out what is the best, because I don't think anyone knows off the top of their head whether in the long term, the building of that dam really would be the worst thing to do out of a suite of options, or would be in the middle, or would be the best thing to do.
And a layman's question for you, Professor Mulligan, just very quickly. When we talk about exporting power, so they're talking about this Inga Dam is going to be so big, they're going to export power to South Africa. How do you do that? Do you build pylons from the dam all the way to, the grid in South Africa? Hundreds of miles? How does it work? Please help me.
Yes, exactly that. There's no other way. You have to connect to the grid of wherever you want the energy to go. And that has relatively, small local impacts. The problem is that it opens up areas to other activities. So if you're putting pylons through, the Congo rainforest, then you're building a road to do that. When you build roads in rainforests, then, rainforests get damaged in the long term by other kinds of activity, because accessibility is always the driver of deforestation. And so there is that kind of impact, but there's also the enormous requirement for mining for the metals that are required to build those infrastructures. And we're seeing the same kinds of issues in the UK at the moment. We're moving our energy from, fossil fuels to largely offshore wind and solar. And as a result, we're having to change where the grid runs. People don't like that, whether you're in a densely populated area or not. Exactly. And those concerns are valid. Pylons are ugly. And I don't feel the same about wind turbines. I think they're good to look at. But pylons are never good to look at wherever you are. And they do create, across the world, these, this accessibility that drives all sorts of other change, which, is good for development, but is often bad for the environment.
And this leads me neatly to you, Barnaby. So there's always talk about impact on communities. But what do we mean when we talk about that? I mean, what actually happens to a community when, say, a dam is built and, say, as Professor Mulligan says, you build pylons all the way from Kinshasa to Johannesburg?
Yeah, the main thing is displacement, and the most obvious thing. So you have to move your land or move your house or both. And the record of doing this well is really bad. So the sort of largest database of displacement is by a guy called Via Scudder, who's based in the US. I think he's still with us, but he's worked on his whole career on displacement, and really shows that there hasn't been a good case of this going well, that communities almost invariably are worse off after displacement, and it takes at least several generations to get back to the same level of economic. So this is just really hard to do. And the reason is that you're not only just losing your physical assets, often you're losing some of the sort of intangible things that made your land work if you're a farmer, or you're losing access to markets or other sort of resources. And you often are also losing elements that sort of make us work as a society. You're losing the sort of community structures which allowed you to help depend on each other. Often one of the sort of classic problems has been that if you're displacing people for a dam, they're often near a river. So they're able to use that resource perhaps as irrigation from sort of annual flooding, or they're able to get water from a river. But often when you're being moved to somewhere which is less fertile because it's not next to a river, and often drier. So there's a whole sort of range of problems which depend on what land is available. Normally all the good land is already used up. That's why it's good land. And so there often is these sort of multi-generational impacts.
So it's not just a case of just offering them packages and just paying them and having them resettle maybe in cities or towns.
Sometimes that has worked better. But as I said, there's sort of not a good way of there isn't sort of yet a successful formula where you can say this has definitely worked. And so this is something that's really, really hard to do on the whole. And then, of course, you have just the impacts from changing the river. So sort of as Mark was alluding to, there's a whole series of upstream and downstream changes from building this project, which may be to do with losing fish, so that upstream fishermen who used to be able to rely on fish to depend on migration on a river, maybe that sort of stops. So then you lose other industries as well. And there's a whole sort of other set of impacts related to changing the hydrology of a river, where if you have a sort of cycle of annual flooding, this can provide, if you like, free irrigation and fertilizing services, which many societies around the world have adapted to, so that they farm in between these sort of annual flooding cycles, and that land can be really rich and again very hard to replace. So there's a whole sort of set of downstream, immediate, sort of longer term impacts which result from this.
It's a whole ecosystem going here, yeah. And Clement, Sefa-Nyarko, if I can bring you in, talk to me about risks. So a dam of this nature, say it's been built, it's flourishing, it's having, lots of electricity coming out of it. What are the problems politically that could bring?
Yeah, I mean, political risk is always easy to predict, but also difficult, depending on where you stand and the kind of information available, but also what opportunities are there. I mean, considering that DRC is already a hotspot for conflict, I think there's a very high risk that if this is even ever successfully built, that it will create there will be a risk of political tensions escalating, especially because already even before it was built, there's contestations around who to invest more and where. South Africa has shown a lot of interest in investing and importing that from DRC when it's done. And precisely because there is very minimum state control across the country. And the fact that to export the electricity in itself from the Inga Dam to anywhere else, you need access to other patches of land just to build a post for transportation, but also even to build road networks. So that also increases other risks of community upheavals, but also protests and conflicts that can heighten the political crisis there in that country. I don't really see how the Inga Dam can reverse the trend of crisis, unless your argument is that the dam is going to supply the people themselves, to give them access to electricity, to do something to open up the communities, to do something to reduce other risks of conflict escalating. That is not on the agenda as far as I can see and as far as the data shows. So there will be even more political risk as this dam gets built and as people invest in it,
And Professor Mulligan, your database says that there's about 41,000 dams being created, and the rate has heightened in the last 60 years. I know you said earlier that not all energy that comes out of dams is clean energy. I thought it's just a case of HEP, hydroelectric power, that the flow of the river turns the turbines or the motors, I don't know what the technical terms are, and then they in turn generate the current that feeds the grid.
Yes, I mean, there are maybe 40, 50,000 medium to large dams in the world, big concrete dams. Depending on how we define that, there are millions of smaller dams, right? Farm dams and so on. And yet we have to think about the full costs when we think about the environmental pedigree of a dam. For sure, the production of the energy is renewable, since you're just using water to drive turbines around, and that's generating electricity for you. But there are huge environmental costs, including CO2 costs in the construction materials, in concrete. The production of cement and concrete, it creates a lot of CO2, but all the other materials that are required too. So the building and the maintenance of a dam has a large impact. And then dams that have large reservoirs, particularly in tropical regions, tend to accumulate lots of organic matter in these reservoirs, and that organic matter tends to produce a very potent greenhouse gas, methane. And then dams have other impacts too. So it's not that they're entirely clean, but then no way of generating electricity is entirely clean. And we just have to recognize that they all have an environmental cost. And one of the real challenges with dams that we haven't really got our heads around at the moment, until now, perhaps, is that they don't last forever either. The average lifespan of a dam is 100 years. And most of the dams that we've built in the world, we've built in the last, 100 years. So at some point very soon, we're going to have to start taking some of these dams down, because otherwise they will fall down. And we have seen, some examples of that. And, taking a dam down could be as costly as building a dam. So when we're thinking about this dam again, we've also got to think, okay, what's its lifespan going to be? Over the time of that, are we going to look after this watershed and ensure that soil erosion doesn't occur by protecting and carefully managing the land upstream of the dam? Because if we don't, then both the small reservoirs that are created will fill with sediment, and the turbines will be damaged by sediment. And then, do we have a plan for what to do with it long term as it degrades and the maintenance costs increase?
Let me bring in Barnaby Dye.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly come in to emphasize this point about the production of methane, which on the other side of the Atlantic in Brazil, some estimates put dams as producing as much as somewhere between a coal and a gas-fired power plant. So sort of really significant amounts of carbon being contributed from dams, because in a tropical place, of course, you're getting much more vegetation coming in, as Mark said, and this is producing methane. And I haven't seen any estimates for what this would be for Inga, so I'm not sure if it would be equivalent to some of those Brazilian dams, but of course this is a real worry if you care about that.
And Clement, from a development standpoint again, when we're talking about this, dummy, I know you talked earlier about seeing who benefits, but who actually benefits or will benefit from it were it to be put up?
I mean, normally dams are built within the context of a national development agenda. And so normally you would say a dam is built for the population within the catchment area where the construction is done. And so if you go to, in fact, almost every country, in Ghana, you have the Akosombo Dam that serves more than 60% of the country. In fact, until newer dams came, Akosombo was supplying electricity to everyone in the country. So that was part of the plan. And I can think of many other dams as well. Unfortunately, like we said, again, was planned in the 1970s by Seku, of course, with investment from abroad. And the plan was to serve DRC and the sub-region. In fact, serving the sub-region was part of the original plan. Unfortunately, over so many years of several wars and different governments, it's become a very investment-driven agenda, really. And if you look at all the documents around it, it doesn't look like there's an agenda to serve the immediate populace or even to serve DRC in the first place. So if you ask who will benefit, obviously it's the investors who put in their money and possibly get it back in multiples. And then countries that have the resources to import, which includes South Africa, that has made it very clear is going to import from there. The local populations, we come back to the transitions conversation of justice and distribution justice, who really will benefit and how is it going to benefit them. It doesn't look like the beneficiaries include DRC population or those within the immediate environment, unless, of course, they have put in investment where they reap, profit rather than benefiting from the energy itself that's going to be produced. So in this particular case, it's really very investment-driven rather than needs-driven.
Sure. And Professor Mulligan, the food and energy needs of the world, especially in low-income countries, is only going to increase over time. We can't see that abating anytime soon. And therefore, the risk or the pressure on governments in those countries to build more of these dams, potential ecological problems down the line.
Yes, I don't think, we're going to stop building and using and maintaining dams at any point soon globally. But I think we do have to just be a bit more careful in how we plan them, how we build them, and how we manage them, with a more sort of science-led approach to how they work as a set of dams. And for sure they are important in global food production and in global energy production. So there's no getting away from that. And the alternatives aren't there, particularly in semi-arid or seasonally dry countries, or, if there are alternatives, they also have impacts. So we will be living with dams, I think. It's just important to understand what impacts they have and to make the right decisions. And as we were saying earlier, I think the big projects are the ones that really are the most risky in terms of, first of all, understanding what their impacts might be. But secondly, what happens when there is a problem.
And Barnaby Dye, if the problem with dams is the impact it has on the livelihoods of people that live in the area, on societal cohesion, as you mentioned, could the answer, and this is a total layman's thing I've heard, that a small can the size of Coke, a Coke can with nuclear energy can power a whole country. Can that be the solution, or is it equally as dirty?
Well, nuclear power has all sorts of problems, particularly to do with waste, also major security issues, and of course, getting hold of uranium if you're using that as a fuel. Of course, there's this promise of fusion, which would be a whole other thing. But I think, sort of going back to one of the points Mark made, I think there is a sort of challenge of building these large centralized projects to try and meet the development needs of a whole country. And especially one the size of DRC, where a lot of the demand for electricity is coming from the Katanga region in the south, where you have a lot of the mines who need the electricity, which is really far away from where the Inga project would be. And then, of course, if you care about trying to use these big investments to try and solve conflict, of course, that's more in Congo and in the eastern DRC, which is basically on the other side of the continent. So it does seem to be a challenge if you're really trying to address the needs of a whole country to build these sort of like singular large projects. And I'm not aware that we're at a stage where nuclear power is sort of at a scale where it can be delivered in such a small way. In the UK, we're thinking about these small modular reactors, but this is a technology which maybe started to happen in sort of richer countries, I think it will take a long time before it can be easily moved to a context like DRC, not least for various security concerns. One sort of worried about Chernobyl-like disasters with nuclear power.
Right. And Clement, I'll come to everybody just before we end and ask them what they're going to be focusing on the next week. But just before I ask you that, Clement, given the fact that, dams are pretty much the best in terms of the possible opportunities that they may present in African countries that are not landlocked, is the new refrain, build, baby, build? Not quoting anyone here.
Yeah, I know. You're not quoting anyone. Obviously, you're not quoting me. I mean, dams are not the very best, but they are among good options in terms of clean technology. And for me, I see dam as problematic in itself because of the nature of the amount of land it covers and holds for several years, decades, in fact. And the fact that, especially if you are building reservoirs, you move people from their homes and it's so disruptive. It just covers a space of land. And obviously depending on, if you're able to make it more efficient in terms of energy production and transportation delivery, then it's fine, But, if you have a project like Inga, then you probably wouldn't think about it this way. Obviously, because Mark has said, it is big, massive, and you don't want to build at that scale and then transport to almost everywhere in Southern Africa. Build, I wouldn't. Of course, if it's the best option in the context of the country, in terms of geographics, in terms of available resources, then it is a good option. Obviously, if it's going to cause more troubles and you are not going to have the kind of investment you need, and it's taking you almost half a century to get the kind of investment you need, then it's probably the worst investment you can think about. But I would go for other cleaner sources of energy, wind, solar, but also, in terms of those that require critical minerals for cleaner and renewable energy sources.
Okay. And just before we go, Clement, since I'm talking to you very quickly, what's going to be your focus over the next week or so from a leadership, security, and development perspective?
Yeah, my research really looks at justice in the transitions with a focus on critical minerals and mining in general. So I have a few projects happening. I have a trip to Ghana to research around illegal mining and how that fits into climate and sustainability conversations, and that's coming in the next month or so. So part of my activities for this week look into that. There's Africa Week happening next week where I have 2 panels, but also there are several other panels and programs there that I look forward to participating as well. And of course, I'm teaching as well. And this is this is one of the busy weeks. So yes, gonna be busy. Thanks for asking.
Okay. And Barnaby, to you, just before we go, what are you going to be looking at from development, policy and practice standpoints?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to use this opportunity partly just to shamelessly plug a policy manual I did, which I think really speaks to some of the sort of points Mark was making around just really wanting with these large dams to think about the evidence and really seriously think about the trade-offs involved. There are major positives and there are major negatives. And there was a policy report I wrote called the Future Dams Manual, which talks through a way of trying to structurally sort of do that type of thinking. But I'm going to be going to Clement's panels for the Africa Week.
All right. And finally, Mark Mulligan, what you're going to be looking at vis-a-vis the Global Dam Watch database and other things relating to dams over the next week or so?
So I'm really interested particularly in a sort of higher income country context where dams are providing water for food or water for energy. In the idea of efficiency, there's a lot of waste in energy. There's a lot of inefficiency in energy use and particularly in water use. And water is energy to an extent as well because it requires energy to pump water. And that's never looked at in the same way as sort of big development projects like this. And you know, in many contexts, we can build fewer dams and we can have less impact on the environment by increasing the efficiency of what we do. I'm particularly working at the moment on a project looking at flooding in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, where we're using what are called green-grey solutions, right? Dams are an example of a grey infrastructure solution. We're using concrete to manage the environment, but you can also use nature to achieve some of the same things. Better management of nature, better management of land. And so these kind of green-grey solutions are, you know, I think are the future, where you do something with concrete, but you also better manage your land to achieve what you need and have more distributed systems. I will also plug our Global Dam Watch socials on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, where you know, we put out dams in the news, dam of the week. So if you're interested in dams, then sign up to those, and you'll get something in your inbox every week.
Great, excellent. Mark Mulligan, Barnaby and Clement Sefa-Nyarko. Thank you all, gentlemen, very much indeed. Unfortunately, it's just been gentlemen this week. But this is Esau Williams. We'll be back again with another podcast next time. Goodbye.